All right, so welcome back to part 2B. All right, so we've got our four terms here, and we can combine them to create our four different behavior modification techniques. We've got punishment, which means we're decreasing the frequency of a behavior. Reinforcement means you're increasing the frequency of a behavior. Positive means you're adding a stimulus. Negative means you're removing a stimulus. And we can use these terms to make this little table here. So this is our table with our two different dimensions. We've got the positive and negative dimension on our x-axis. We've got reinforcement and punishment on our y-axis. I would highly encourage you guys to get familiar with this table. Make this table on your own and see if you can fill in the squares. So reinforcement and punishment, positive and negative, and know what these terms mean. And again, I just want to stress negative reinforcement time and time again. This is the one that I see students struggle with the most. And it's because they see the word negative and they think negative means bad. Negative in this context does not mean bad. It just means the removal of a stimulus. So negative reinforcement means you're increasing the frequency of a behavior by removing something pleasant. Or removing something unpleasant. All right, let's move on. We've got a couple different scenarios here, and I want to walk through these scenarios, and then we're going to pick out the important bits and figure out what behavior modification technique is being used. So what's the behavior? Is that behavior increasing or decreasing? What is the stimulus? Is that stimulus being added or taken away? All right, first scenario. It might be a good idea for you to pause the video at the start of these scenarios and see if you can figure it out on your own before I walk through the answers here. So, scenario number one, Chuck has learned that if he leaves early for work, he can avoid heavy traffic. All right, so our behavior is going to be leaving early for work, and our stimulus is going to be heavy traffic. So the behavior is leaving early for work, and that is going to increase in frequency. Chuck is going to be doing this more often. So right off the bat, the behavior is increasing. We know it's reinforcement. And traffic, specifically heavy traffic, is the stimulus. Now, is traffic being added or taken away? Well, he's avoiding it. So the traffic, the unpleasant traffic, is being taken away. So if something's being taken away, it's negative. And we already established its reinforcement, so we have negative reinforcement. Chuck is more likely to engage in this behavior because an unpleasant stimulus is being removed. Next scenario. Linus praises his little brother by telling him what a great job he's done each time he takes the trash out. Now, his little brother takes the trash out each night without being asked. Our behavior here is going to be taking the trash out, and the stimulus is going to be praise from Big Brother Linus. All right, so is this behavior increasing or decreasing? Well, it's more likely to happen, so it's increasing. So boom, we know it's reinforcement. Now on to the stimulus. Is it negative or is it positive? Praise. Is praise being added or is praise being taken away? Well, in this case, praise is being added. So now we know it's positive. So positive reinforcement. Little Linus Jr., or whatever his name is going to take that trash out more often because Big Brother Linus provided that praise. Next scenario. Every time Kyle kicks his big brother, he gets yelled at by his dad. So Kyle doesn't kick his brother anymore. What's the behavior? Kicking. What's the stimulus? Getting yelled at. And there we are. So the behavior of kicking your brother is likely to decrease. And that means it's punishment. Yelling from dad is being applied to the situation. So if something is being applied or added, we know it's positive. So if a behavior is decreasing and an unpleasant stimulus is being added, we've got positive punishment. Next one. Joe gets a parking ticket for parking in a handicap spot and has to pay a fine. Now he no longer parks in handicap spots. The behavior that's being changed is parking in handicap spots. The stimulus is going to be the parking ticket. Now this one gets a little ambiguous. The behavior is definitely decreasing, right? Parking in a handicap spot is less likely to occur in the future because something unpleasant happened. So we have punishment, but now the stimulus could be seen as a positive stimulus or it could be seen as a negative stimulus. So if you think about this as getting a parking ticket, a parking ticket is an unpleasant thing that's being added onto you, it's being applied to you. If that's the case, then it's positive punishment. But if you think about what a parking ticket actually does, is it takes money away from you. It removes something pleasant. So if that's the case, then it's negative punishment. Something is being taken away. Now, in this particular example, there's no right answer. It could be positive punishment, it could be negative punishment. But when it comes time for a quiz question or an exam question, I want you to know that as long as you can explain it to me properly, as long as you can explain why a parking ticket might be positive or negative punishment, then you will definitely get full points for that. So I don't want you to stress out thinking, I can't remember if Professor Goldstein said a ticket is positive or negative. As long as as long as you can explain why it would be positive because a parking ticket is being added, or why it would be negative because money is being taken away. As long as you show that level of understanding, that's all I'm looking for. And there's our table once again. So again, I highly recommend you spend some time familiarizing yourself with this table and really focus on negative reinforcement. Again, that's the one that students struggle with the most. Okay. So what are some of the factors that influence whether or not operant conditioning works? First and foremost is time, specifically the time between when a behavior occurs and when a consequence follows. So if you can close that gap, operant conditioning is likely to be successful. But if there's a big gap between when a behavior occurs and when a consequence occurs, the organism is less likely to make those connections. So think about this for a second. If you're trying to train your dog and you give them a treat when they sit on command, you give that treat almost immediately. They sit down, you give them a treat. That's a very good example. They're going to learn really well in that situation. Now let's say they sit when told, but you wait a full 5 minutes before you give that treat. They're going to go crazy. A lot of things are going to happen between when they sat down and when you finally gave them that treat. They're not going to learn that relationship between sitting on command and getting rewarded. So learning is not going to work very well in that situation. All right, the second factor there is consistency. The more consistently you reward a behavior, the better, the more that learning will take place. And we're going to talk about schedules of reinforcement here in just 1 second. And the last factor there is punishment severity. Now, we've already talked about why punishment is not a great way to change behavior. But if you are forced to use punishment, make sure that the punishment is severe. Punishments that are not severe are not very successful in modifying behavior. I mean, punishment in general is less effective than reinforcement. But if for some reason reinforcement can't be used, then punishment must be used. All right, so let's talk about schedules of reinforcement. So a continuous schedule of reinforcement is when an organism gets rewarded every single time the target behavior occurs. So if your dog sits on command, you give them a treat every single time they do it. An intermittent schedule of reinforcement is when they don't get rewarded every single time. Sometimes they get rewarded, sometimes they don't. And let's talk about what effect that has on the behavior. So our first intermittent schedule of reinforcement that we're going to talk about is fixed ratio. And we're going to break this down into two different terms here, fixed and ratio. Fixed means that the organism is going to get a reward after that behavior presents itself a set number of times. And that's what ratio means, number of times that the behavior occurs. So in a fixed ratio schedule of reinforcement, the organism has to engage in that behavior a certain number of times before they get a reward. So if you're a rat in a cage, you will get rewarded for every 10th lever press. So you have to press the lever 10 times before that treat falls out. A real world example might be a car salesman getting rewarded for every 5 cars that they sell. They don't get rewarded for 1, 2, 3, or 4, but on that 5th car, they get a nice bonus in their paycheck. Now, this is in contrast to a variable ratio schedule of reinforcement. So we've got a different term here, fixed versus variable. A variable schedule means that they get rewarded after an average number of times the behavior occurs. So if you're that rat in that cage, you get rewarded for, on average, 5 lever presses. So sometimes you get rewarded for pressing the lever 3 times. Sometimes you have to press the lever 8 times to get a reward. But on average, you get a reward for every 5 lever presses. A real world example of this would be slot machines. If you've ever been to a casino and used a slot machine, you know this. You don't win money every single time you pull the lever on a slot machine. Sometimes you win money after pulling the lever 5 times. Sometimes you win money after pulling the lever 20 times. You do win money, but it's not after a set number of times. It varies around an average. That's what variable means. So that's ratio schedules of reinforcement. And now we're going to briefly talk about interval schedules of reinforcement. So a ratio schedule of reinforcement depends on the number of times that a behavior occurs. An interval schedule of reinforcement depends on time, an interval of time. So a fixed interval schedule of reinforcement means the organism is going to get reinforced for the first time that behavior occurs after a set amount of time. So if you're that rat in that cage, let's say you get rewarded for the first lever press every minute. So an entire minute has to pass before you can press that lever and get a reward. A real world example of this might be your paycheck from a job. You get that paycheck every 2 weeks. So no matter what, you're not going to get rewarded for your behavior until payday comes around. Variable interval is our next schedule of reinforcement. Once again, it's interval, but this time it's variable, meaning that the organism will get rewarded for the first time the behavior occurs after an average amount of time has passed. So sometimes that rat gets rewarded for the first lever press after 30 seconds. Sometimes the rat gets rewarded for the first lever press after a minute and 30 seconds. But it varies around that average length of time of 1 minute. A real world example of this might be checking your email. You don't get rewarded with an email every single time you check your email, if you can count emails as rewards. But every once in a while, you do get rewarded for checking your email by having an email. So we can break these terms down. Fixed means a set amount. That could be a set amount of lever presses or a set amount of time. Variable means it varies around an average. After an average number of 10 lever presses, that rat will get a treat. Ratio means the number of responses, the number of times that behavior occurs. Interval means time has to pass. The organism will get rewarded for the first time that behavior occurs after an amount of time has passed. All right, so what does that look like on a graph? We can break this graph down a little bit. I know it looks confusing at first. So on our y-axis, we've got cumulative number of responses. So this is the number of times that a behavior occurs. As you go towards the top of the graph, the behavior is occurring more often. Towards the bottom of the graph, the behavior is occurring less often. And then our x-axis is time. So let's start with the red line. And this red line is our VR line. That's our variable ratio. Now, these horizontal tick marks here, these represent, excuse me, these represent the times that the organism was rewarded. So this is when the treat is dispensed in the rat's cage. So the fact that this line kind of skyrockets almost straight up, that means the rat is pressing that lever like crazy. The organism is engaging in the behavior at a very high rate, a very fast pace. So think about this. The rat's in the cage, and it knows it might get rewarded on the very next lever press. It knows it will eventually get rewarded, but it could be the very next lever press that treat comes down on. So what's this going to do? That's going to highly motivate that rat to press that lever like crazy. And that's exactly what this straight up and down line represents. The rat is pressing it like crazy, hoping that a treat might come down at any second. Now contrast this to the blue line. This is our FR line, our fixed ratio line. And we've got a much different situation. So once again, these, well, not really horizontal, but these sort of perpendicular tick marks, that represents the organism getting a reward. And this time we've got like steps going on. So what's going on here? Well, we've got our rat in a cage, and it knows that it's going to get rewarded for every 20th lever press. That's fixed ratio, every 20th lever press. So the rat pushes the lever 20 times, gets a treat, and then it takes a little break. That's what this horizontal section means. Because it knows no matter what, it's going to have to push that lever 20 more times to get the next treat. There's no rush. It's not like the VR line where the very next lever press could result in a treat. This is a set amount of times that you have to press the lever to get a treat, whether it's 10 or 20 or whatever. So the rat takes a little break. But before long, it gets hungry again and it starts pressing the lever. So you see this increase in the amount of the behavior. And they get rewarded again. And once again, they take a little break. And this is what we see. We see immediately after a reward, there's just a short break. And then before too long, the behavior starts up again. This green line is our VI line, our variable interval. So variable, again, means that it varies around an average. Interval means interval means amount of time. So this rat is getting rewarded after the first lever press after a variable amount of time has passed. So sometimes they get rewarded for the first lever press after 30 seconds. Sometimes they get rewarded for the first lever press after a minute, but it varies around an average of, say, 45 seconds. So if that's the case, we see just kind of a gradual increase in the amount of behavior. So this rat is just kind of pressing that lever in a pretty consistent way because they don't know which lever press is going to get rewarded. It could be the next one, but it's just not quite as extreme as this variable ratio red line. And our last line here, the black line, FI, stands for fixed interval. So this time the rat gets rewarded for the first lever press after a fixed amount of time has passed. So they're getting rewarded for the first lever press after 10 seconds has passed or 30 seconds has passed. So here we have this kind of step motion once again, but this time we've got kind of swoopy step motions, almost like waves on an ocean. So what we see here is the organism barely engaging in the behavior, but as that interval gets close to the end, we see a huge increase in the behavior. And then they get their treat, and then the behavior stops again. But as the time starts ticking away and they know that they're going to get rewarded for the first lever press after that 20 seconds has passed, they start engaging in the behavior like crazy once again. And that's why we see these sharp inclines. They get rewarded, they take a break. The time gets closer, they go push that lever like crazy, they get rewarded, they take a break. So it's just like the fixed ratio, but slightly different with these swooping kind of actions going on. I would prefer that you guys are much more familiar with variable ratio and fixed ratio, variable interval and fixed interval, a little less important to know about. All right, so let's talk about superstitious behavior. I'm actually going to pause the video right here, and we'll have to pick it up in part 2C.